They buried MY's safety report. Then an accident proved I was right 3 years ago. I filed a safety report warning that a piece of equipment at our manufacturing plant was going to hurt someone if it wasn't fixed. My plant manager buried that report. 4 months later, that exact machine injured a coworker of mine badly enough that he spent 6 weeks in the hospital. I was blamed for the accident, not my manager. Me. It took me 2 years to prove what actually happened. And when I finally did, I wasn't just vindicated. I ended up standing in that same plant, in a hard hat with a federal investigator's badge clipped to it, walking through the doors of the company that fired me. Let me tell you how that happened. Chapter 1. Me name is Odalise Marin. 5 years ago, I started working at Brannigan Fabrication, a mid-size metal manufacturing plant just outside Pittsburgh that produced structural components for commercial construction projects. I started on the floor as a machine operator, and within 2 years, worked my way up to safety compliance coordinator, a role that put me in charge of tracking equipment maintenance schedules, running safety audits, and flagging hazards before they became injuries. It's not a job people think about much, safety compliance. Nobody claps for the person who catches a problem before it happens. You only get noticed when something goes wrong, and even then, the notice usually isn't the kind you want. My plant manager was a man named Harlan Voss. Harlan had run the Pittsburgh plant for almost 15 years, and he ran it the way a lot of long-tenured plant managers run their operations, with an intense, almost obsessive focus on production numbers, and a much looser relationship with anything that slowed those numbers down. For the first year in my new role, Harlan and I got along fine. I flagged small issues, he addressed most of them, and the plant's safety record stayed reasonably solid. I didn't understand yet how much of that record depended on which issues I flagged actually reaching anyone above Harlan, and which ones simply disappeared into his inbox. That understanding started to form the day I found the problem with press line 4. If you've ever noticed something dangerous at work and felt like nobody wanted to hear about it, comment below. Because that feeling is exactly where this story begins, and it gets a lot more serious from here. Chapter 2, Press Line 4, was one of our older hydraulic stamping presses, used to shape heavy steel components for structural beams. During a routine quarterly inspection, I noticed the emergency stop mechanism on the press was responding with a delay, nearly a full second slower than the safety threshold specified in the manufacturer's documentation and required under our facility's own safety protocol. A 1-second delay doesn't sound like much. On a piece of equipment that can exert over 200 tons of force, a 1-second delay is the difference between a hand getting clear of a die and a hand not getting clear. I documented the issue immediately, following our standard reporting procedure. A formal written safety report, submitted through our internal system, flagged as high priority, recommending the press be taken offline until the emergency stop mechanism could be repaired or replaced. I brought it to Harlan directly the same afternoon, since high-priority reports were supposed to trigger an in-person conversation, not just sit in a queue. Harlan, Press Line 4's emergency stop is failing threshold testing. Nearly a full second delay. I've submitted the formal report, but I wanted to flag it directly given the severity. Harlan barely looked up from his desk. How far off is it exactly? 0.92 seconds over threshold. That press has been running fine for 6 years, Odalise. We've got the Kessler construction order due in 11 days, and Press Line 4 is the only one rated for that beam gauge. Taking it offline right now would blow that deadline completely. I understand the timing is bad, but the emergency stop failure is a real hazard. If someone's hand is in the die zone during a malfunction, that delay is enough to cause a serious injury. Harlan finally looked up. I'll get maintenance to take a look at it after the Kessler order ships. In the meantime, make sure the floor supervisors reinforce proper hand placement protocol on that line. That should cover us until we can get it scheduled. Harlan, that's not really unacceptable. I hear you, Odalise, he said, in a tone that made clear the conversation was over. Noted. Now let's get back to the Kessler timeline. Chapter break here, because I want you to remember this exact conversation, word for word if you can, because it becomes critically important later. Specifically the fact that Harlan acknowledged the report verbally, in person, while simultaneously making sure nothing about that acknowledgement ever became official. Chapter THREI didn't let it go. even though Harlan clearly wanted me to. I followed up twice over the next 2 weeks, once through email, CCing our facility's general maintenance supervisor, and once in person again, both times getting some version of the same response, acknowledgement, reassurance, and no actual action. What I didn't know at the time was that Harlan had a very specific reason for prioritizing the Kessler construction deadline above almost everything else. Kessler was Brannigan Fabrication's single largest client, representing nearly 30% of the plant's annual revenue, and Harlan's own performance bonus, structured heavily around on-time delivery metrics for major accounts, depended significantly on maintaining that relationship without disruption. Taking press line 4 offline for repairs, even for a few days, would have meant missing the Kessler deadline for the first time in the account's history, something Harlan was determined to avoid regardless of what it required. The Kessler order shipped on time. Press line 4 kept running. 4 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, a machine operator named Desmond Whitlow, a coworker I'd trained myself 2 years earlier, someone I considered a friend, had his hand caught in press line 4's die during a routine cycle. The emergency stop engaged, but nearly a full second too late. Desmond spent 6 weeks in the hospital. He underwent 3 surgeries. He never fully regained function in his right hand, and he never returned to machine operation work again. I remember exactly where I was standing when I heard the emergency alarm that afternoon. I remember running toward press line 4, already knowing, with a sick certainty, exactly what had happened and exactly why. If you've ever watched something you tried to prevent happen anyway, because the people with the power to stop it chose not to, comment below. Because what happened to me in the aftermath of that accident is the part of this story that still makes me angriest. Even now, Chapter 4 Brannigan Fabrication launched a formal internal investigation into the accident, as required by both company policy and state workplace safety regulations. I assumed, naively, that my original safety report, dated 4 months before the accident, clearly documenting the exact emergency stop delay that caused Desmond's injury, would be the central piece of evidence in that investigation. I was called into a meeting with Harlan and 2 representatives from the company's corporate safety division, flown in from Brannigan's headquarters specifically to oversee the investigation. Odalys, we've reviewed the incident and the maintenance history on press line 4. One of the corporate representatives, a man named Chester Grimaldi, said, "We understand you conducted the most recent quarterly inspection on that press. You walk us through your findings." I found the emergency stop mechanism was failing threshold testing by nearly a full second, I said. I submitted a formal high-priority safety report immediately, and I followed up with Harlan directly twice over the following weeks. Chester glanced down at a folder in front of him. We don't have a record of a formal safety report matching that description in our system for press line 4 during that time frame. I felt my stomach drop. I submitted it. Through the standard reporting system, I can show you the date. Records show your last formal report on press line 4 was filed nearly 7 months before the accident for an unrelated hydraulic fluid issue that was resolved at the time, Chester said. We don't have anything on file regarding an emergency stop delay. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. That's not possible. I submitted it myself directly into the system. Harlan, sitting across the table, said nothing, his expression carefully neutral. Odalys, Chester continued, given the maintenance gap on this press, and given that you were the safety coordinator responsible for flagging this exact category of hazard, we need to understand why a known emergency stop deficiency wasn't formally escalated in the 4 months leading up to this accident. I understood, in that exact moment, precisely what was happening. My report hadn't just been ignored. It had been deleted, or altered, or somehow removed from the system entirely. And the story being constructed in that room was one where the accident happened not because Harlan chose to keep a dangerous press running to meet a deadline, but because I had failed to do my job. If you're feeling that specific kind of dread right now, imagining what it's like to sit in a room and realize the evidence that would clear you has simply vanished, I need you to sit with that feeling for a second, because I lived inside it for almost 2 years. Comment below, because this next part is where things get complicated in a way I never expected. Chapter FIVEI was placed on administrative leave the following week, pending the conclusion of the investigation. 6 weeks later, I was formally terminated, with the internal investigation report citing failure to escalate a known safety hazard in accordance with company protocol as the primary factor contributing to Desmond's accident. Desmond, still recovering from his third surgery at the time, reached out to me privately, deeply confused. "Odalise, I don't understand. You're the one who's always on top of the equipment stuff." What happened? I told him the truth, as much as I understood it at the time. That I'd filed the report, that Harlan had acknowledged it verbally twice. That somehow, by the time the investigation happened, none of that existed in any official record. Desmond believed me. But Desmond, recovering from a serious injury and dependent on the workers' compensation claim Brannigan was processing, wasn't in a position to fight a corporate narrative on my behalf, and I understood that completely. I never once resented him for staying quiet during that period. He had his own battle to survive. I filed for unemployment, which Brannigan contested, citing the termination for cause. I appealed, which took months, and which I eventually won, but the process left me both financially strained and professionally radioactive within the manufacturing safety field. A small, tightly networked industry where word about a safety coordinator, responsible for an employee losing partial use of his hand, travels fast and lands hard. I spent almost a year doing unrelated work, temp jobs, warehouse shifts, anything that paid the bills, while trying to understand what had actually happened to my original report, and whether I had any way of proving it had ever existed at all. Second twist coming in the next chapter, and it's the one that changed the entire direction of this story. If you're finding this one compelling so far, go ahead and subscribe now, because what I discovered next took me completely by surprise. Chapter 6. The break came almost by accident, nearly a year after my termination, through a woman named Renata Okonkwo, a former IT systems administrator who had also left Brannigan Fabrication under complicated circumstances of her own, roughly 8 months after I did. We connected initially through a mutual contact in a manufacturing industry forum, just swapping general frustrations about the company, before Renata mentioned something that stopped me completely. "Actually remember your name from an internal ticket," she said. "Right before I left, there was an IT support request from Harlan Voss's office, asking about permanently deleting a specific safety report entry from the compliance database, citing it as a duplicate submission error. I didn't process that request personally. One of my colleagues did, but I remember flagging internally that it seemed unusual, because our system doesn't typically generate true duplicate entries the way he described it." "Do you remember when that request happened?" I asked, my hands already shaking. Renata pulled up an old personal calendar she'd kept, cross-referencing work notes from that period. The date she found was 3 days after my second in-person follow-up conversation with Harlan about Press Line 4. "I still have some old email threads from that time, archived personally, from before I left," Renata said. Departments often get looped in on deletion requests for compliance purposes, even informally. Let me see what I can find." 2 weeks later, Renata sent me a set of archived internal emails she'd saved to her personal account years earlier, for reasons she said she couldn't fully explain even to herself at the time, beyond a vague instinct that something about that deletion request hadn't sat right with her. The emails showed Harlan explicitly requesting the removal of my Press Line 4 safety report from the compliance database, describing it internally as an erroneous duplicate entry causing confusion in the maintenance queue, a description that didn't match anything about the actual report I'd filed. The report hadn't vanished on its own. Harlan had it deleted, deliberately, within days of my second follow-up conversation with him. If you saw that coming, tell me in the comments. And if you didn't, we're still not even at the confrontation yet. This story has several more turns before we get there. Chapter 7, armed with Renata's archived emails, I contacted an employment attorney who specialized in workplace safety retaliation cases, a methodical, no-nonsense man named Gideon Ashworth. "This is a serious case," Gideon told me, after reviewing everything. "What you're describing potentially violates both state workplace safety regulations and federal whistleblower protection statutes, specifically because you were terminated, at least in part, based on the absence of a report that was deliberately removed by the very person responsible for acting on it. We filed a formal complaint with the state's Occupational Safety and Health Division, supported by Renata's archived emails, along with a parallel wrongful termination claim against Brannigan Fabrication. The state safety investigation took nearly 8 months, involving formal document requests, sworn depositions, and a forensic review of Brannigan's internal reporting database. Conducted by an outside digital forensics firm, the state agency contracted specifically for cases involving alleged data tampering. The forensic review confirmed what Renata's emails had already suggested. My original safety report had, in fact, existed in the system, submitted on the date I remembered, flagged as high priority exactly as I'd described. It had been deleted 11 days later, using an administrative override credential registered to Harlan Voss. The investigators also found something else, something I hadn't known to look for. Harlan's deletion request wasn't an isolated incident. Cross-referencing the plant's compliance database against maintenance and incident records going back nearly 6 years, investigators identified 4 other instances where safety reports flagging equipment issues had been deleted or significantly altered within days of submission, always shortly before a major client deadline, always using Harlan's administrative credentials. None of those 4 earlier reports had resulted in a serious injury. Mine was, as far as the investigators could determine, simply the first time the underlying hazard had actually materialized into an accident before it could be caught some other way. This is the part of the investigation that genuinely shook me, more than almost anything else in this story. Because it meant Desmond's accident wasn't a single bad decision made under deadline pressure. It was the eventual, statistically inevitable result of a pattern that had been running quietly for years, and I just happened to be the coordinator standing there when it finally caught up with everyone. If that's landing heavy for anyone listening, comment below, because it landed heavy for me too. Chapter: The state investigation confirmed the deletion pattern and the deliberate falsification of safety records. The case moved quickly into much more serious territory. Deliberately falsifying safety compliance records, particularly in a case connected to a documented workplace injury, carries significant regulatory penalties, and in cases involving demonstrated pattern and intent, can rise to the level of criminal liability under certain state workplace safety statutes. Brannigan Fabrication's corporate leadership, facing the state agency's findings, along with the looming threat of a wrongful termination lawsuit and potential regulatory fines that could run into the millions given the pattern across multiple incidents, launched their own emergency internal review, separate from mine, specifically focused on Harlan's tenure as plant manager. Harlan was placed on administrative leave within days of Brannigan receiving the state investigation's preliminary findings. 2 months later, following the internal review, he was formally terminated, and the state referred the falsification findings to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to the deliberate destruction of safety compliance records connected to a workplace injury. I was contacted personally by Chester Grimaldi, the same corporate safety representative who had sat across from me in that original investigation meeting, informing me that Brannigan's corporate leadership wanted to formally reverse my termination, expunge the failure to escalate finding from my employment record, and offer a financial settlement covering back pay, damages, and legal costs. "Odalise," Chester said, his voice noticeably different than it had been in that original meeting, "I want to be honest with you. I believe the record I was given at the time. I should have pushed harder on the maintenance gap questions during that original investigation instead of accepting the explanation I was handed. I'm sorry for the role I played in that. If you were me, hearing that apology, how would you have felt? I still don't have a completely clean answer for that one myself." Comment below, because we're getting close to the end now, and this next part is the piece of the story I'm most proud of. Chapter 9 settled my wrongful termination claim against Brannigan Fabrication roughly 4 months after Harlan's termination became final. I can't disclose the specific terms, But I can tell you the settlement was structured to fully cover the 2 years of lost income, legal costs, and reputational damage I'd experienced within the manufacturing safety field. But the settlement wasn't the part of this story that mattered most to me. During the course of the state investigation, I'd spent significant time working alongside the outside forensics firm and the state safety inspectors handling my case, walking them through the technical details of press line maintenance protocols, emergency stop threshold testing, and the specific reporting gaps that had allowed Harlan's pattern to continue undetected for years. One of the lead state investigators, a woman named Carol Pemberton, who'd spent nearly 15 years in industrial workplace safety enforcement, pulled me aside near the end of the investigation. "Odalise, I don't say this often, but you have a genuine talent for this work. Most safety coordinators I encounter in cases like this either missed the hazard entirely or didn't understand the technical severity well enough to push back effectively. You did both things right, and it still wasn't enough to save you because the system around you failed. I think you'd be exceptional doing this work from the enforcement side instead." I hadn't considered it before that moment, but the idea stayed with me. 6 months after my settlement finalized, I completed the certification process to become a state workplace safety inspector myself, specializing in industrial manufacturing equipment, the exact category of hazard that had defined the worst 2 years of my professional life. This is the part of the story I want you to really sit with, because it's the whole reason I wanted to share it. I didn't just get my job back, or my reputation back, though both of those things mattered enormously. I ended up in a position specifically designed to make sure what happened to Desmond, and to me, happens to fewer people going forward. If you're going through your own version of this fight right now, comment below, because I promise you, the version of your story that comes after the worst part is still being written. Chapter 10, almost exactly 3 years after I first flagged the failing emergency stop mechanism on Press Line 4. I walked back through the doors of Brannigan Fabrications' Pittsburgh plant, this time wearing a state safety inspector's badge, conducting a scheduled compliance audit as part of the plant's ongoing regulatory oversight following Harlan's termination and the broader falsification findings. The current plant manager, a woman named Felicity Duart, brought in specifically to rebuild the facility's safety culture after everything that had happened, walked the floor with me during the inspection. "No, this must be strange for you," she said, "walking back in here in this role after everything." "It's strange," I admitted, "but it's also exactly where I want to be." I inspected Press Line 4 personally during that audit. It had been fully replaced 18 months earlier, part of a broader equipment overhaul Brannigan's new leadership had implemented across the entire facility, specifically addressing the maintenance gaps the falsification pattern had allowed to go unaddressed for years. Desmond still worked at Brannigan, in a different role now, transitioned into quality control after his injury made machine operation impossible. I ran into him on the floor during that inspection, and we stood there for a moment, neither of us quite sure what to say before he finally spoke. "You look good in that badge, Odalise." "Feels strange," I said, "but right somehow." "What it's worth," Desmond said. "I never once believed what they said about you, not for a single day. I think about that conversation more than almost anything else that happened over those 3 years. Not the settlement, not even Harlan's termination. Just Desmond, standing there, telling me he never believed the story they built to explain away what happened to him. Sometimes the people who matter most in these situations aren't the ones who wronged you. They're the ones who never stopped believing you, even when the official record said otherwise." Chapter 11. I've been a state workplace safety inspector for almost 2 years now, specializing in manufacturing equipment across a dozen facilities in the region, including, occasionally, Brannigan Fabrications' Pittsburgh plant, now under leadership genuinely committed to the kind of safety culture Harlan spent years quietly undermining for the sake of deadline metrics and bonus structures. I think about that original conversation with Harlan constantly, the one where I flagged the emergency stop delay, and he told me, calmly, reasonably, that he'd get to it after the Kessler order shipped. I think about how ordinary that conversation felt at the time, how easy it was to believe I'd done my job simply by raising the concern, without understanding that the person receiving it had no intention of ever letting it become an official record. I think about Desmond too, obviously. About the 6 weeks he spent in the hospital, the surgeries, the permanent loss of function in his hand, all of it traceable back to a specific, documented 4-month gap between the day I flagged a genuine hazard and the day it finally hurt someone. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. In safety-critical work especially, but honestly in almost any job, verbal acknowledgement isn't documentation. If something matters enough to report, it matters enough to save independently, outside whatever system your employer controls, because you cannot always assume the record you create will still exist by the time anyone needs to look at it. I got my job back, eventually. I got my name cleared, eventually. But I think about the version of this story where Renata never happened to remember that old IT ticket, where those archived emails never existed, where I simply remained, permanently, the safety coordinator blamed for an accident I spent months trying to prevent. That version of this story is a lot more common than the one I got to live, and it's the reason I do the work I do now. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, because I've got a lot more coming every week. And tell me honestly, if you were me, would you have gone into safety enforcement afterward, or walked away from the industry entirely after everything that happened? I read every single comment. See you in the next one.